Chapter 4. The Reformation Movement. The big question? What did Martin Luther, John Calvin, and others contribute to the Reformation movement? Martin Luther sparked the Reformation, a movement that brought about great religious and political changes. As a young boy growing up in Germany, he could not have known that he would be responsible for such change. Martin Luther was born into a relatively wealthy German family. His father prospered in the copper mining business. His family had enough money to send him to good schools and eventually to the University of Erfurt, one of the best universities in Germany. Luther was an excellent student and earned 2 degrees. In 1505 CE, at age 21, he decided to pursue a 3rd degree in law. But 6 weeks later, he had a sudden change of heart. What happened? As Luther later told the story, he was walking home one night when a terrible storm came. Thunder boomed and lightning blazed across the sky. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning struck dangerously close, knocking Luther to the ground. As the storm raged around him, the terrified Luther vowed that if he survived, he would give his life to God and become a monk. Luther did survive. True to his promise, but much to his father's dismay, he stopped studying law and entered the Augustinian monastery in Erfurt. Growing doubts. Like most Christians of his time, Luther initially accepted what the church taught. The only way into heaven was to do good works, aid the poor, confess his sins, and follow its teachings. But during the years Luther spent in the monastery at Erfurt, he had a lot of time to read the Bible. He pondered biblical passages, as well as his own beliefs. Like most people of this age, Luther wanted to ensure for himself a place in heaven. He began to question, however, the church's teachings with regard to what people had to do to make that happen. He also questioned the role of priests in people's lives. His views were a direct challenge to the church in Rome. Luther's 95 Theses. After several years, Luther was transferred from Erfurt to a monastery at Wittenberg. There, Luther attended the University of Wittenberg. He earned an advanced degree in biblical theology and became a teacher at the university. Luther was a gifted teacher and a powerful speaker. As he continued teaching, he struggled to come to a clearer understanding of his own beliefs and how they differed from church teachings. He was angered by practices within the church that he thought were corrupt. In 1517 CE, an event took place that changed Luther's life and ultimately European history. If you recall, the church raised money by issuing indulgences. People believed that indulgences could speed up their journey to heaven and shorten the amount of time they spent in purgatory, a place people believed their souls went before reaching heaven. The practice of issuing indulgences in exchange for money became intolerable for Luther when he heard about a Dominican friar named John Tetzel. Tetzel not only issued indulgences, he proclaimed that as soon as a coin was received by the church, a soul was released from purgatory. It was essentially saying you could buy the way of a soul into heaven. Outraged, Luther decided to act. He composed a list of 95 objections to the practice of issuing indulgences and sent it in a letter to his superiors. In addition, on October 31st, 1517 CE, Luther nailed a copy of this list, later called his 95 Theses, to the door of the church at the University of Wittenberg. This action was an open invitation to discuss and debate his point of view. Another storm brewing. Luther was trying to start a discussion with his theses, not a revolution. But people who were unhappy with the church were energized by Luther's actions. Luther's theses were quickly translated from Latin into German And thanks to the printing press, thousands of copies were distributed across Europe in just a few months. Encouraged, Luther began speaking out more openly against other church teachings. He also wrote essays in which he discussed the importance of faith and the fact that all believers, wealthy or poor, were equal. These writings, including On Christian Liberty, On the Freedom of a Christian Man, and An Open Letter to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation, were also translated, printed, and widely distributed across Europe. As you can imagine, not everyone was pleased about the stir Luther was causing. In 1518 CE, the Pope summoned Luther to Rome to explain his actions. Fortunately for Luther, Frederick III, the Elector or ruler of Saxony, intervened. Frederick was in a tricky position. He had received a letter from the Pope urging him to turn Luther over to the church officials in Rome. Frederick didn't necessarily agree with Luther's ideas on religion. However, as ruler of the region in which Luther lived, he didn't like the Pope telling his subjects what to do either. In fact, Frederick wanted to increase the power of the German nobility. Not only that, he was tired of sending German money to Rome to pay for perceived papal extravagance. He also suspected that Luther, a German, would not be treated fairly in Rome. Instead of sending Luther to Rome, Frederick had his hearing moved to a city in southern Germany. There, Luther was questioned by church officials about his beliefs. He refused to change his mind. Luther's refusal to back down made the Pope even angrier. In 1520 CE, the Pope issued an official document called a papal bull. In his bull, the Pope attacked Luther and said his writings were those of a heretic. Luther was ordered to recant or take back all that he'd said about the Church and its teachings. A papal what? Important orders issued by the Pope were written on parchment and sealed with a lump of lead. To make the document official, the Pope pressed his signet ring into the lump of metal while it was still warm and soft. The lead lump was called a bulla in Latin, which is why these papal documents came to be called bulls. How did Luther respond? On December 10, 1520 CE, students, professors, and some of the townspeople of Wittenberg gathered before a blazing bonfire. They watched as Martin Luther defiantly dropped a copy of the papal bull into the blaze. In doing so, Luther was publicly defying the Pope. It was a bold and dangerous move. A month later, the Pope formally labeled Luther a heretic and excommunicated him from the Church. Refusal and refuge. Many Germans, including some German noblemen, did not think Luther had been given a fair hearing. In 1521 CE, Luther was ordered to appear before a special assembly called a Diet in the German city of Worms. The Diet of Worms included knights, church officials, and representatives from various towns and regions. When Luther arrived, he thought he would get a chance to defend his ideas. Instead, church officials piled his writings in front of him and again ordered him to denounce his ideas. Luther refused. The Diet of Worms declared Luther to be not just a heretic, but also a criminal. Since it was common to kill heretics and criminals, Luther's life was in danger. Once again, Frederick III of Saxony came to his aid. As Luther traveled back to Wittenberg, the Elector arranged for masked horsemen to pretend to kidnap Luther. Frederick did not believe Luther was guilty of any crime that warranted death. He was also well aware that Luther had gained the support of many of Frederick's own subjects. Luther was whisked off to a castle where he remained in hiding and under Frederick's protection for 10 months. During that time, Luther began translating the New Testament into German. setting a style of language that was more accessible to people. By the time Luther came out of hiding, his push for reform had turned into a religious and political movement that had been greatly strengthened. The power of the printing press was evident as his ideas and beliefs spread far and wide. Those people who believed in his ideas left the Catholic Church and began to worship according to Luther's teachings. Luther and Erasmus. Martin Luther continued to write about his religious ideas for the rest of his life. In the 1520s, he got into a debate with Desiderius Erasmus, a Dutch Renaissance humanist and scholar. Renaissance humanists emphasized learning and scholarship and the ability of human beings to figure out for themselves what is true and important in life. Like Luther, Erasmus wanted to see reform in the Catholic Church. Unlike Luther, he did not break away from the Church and respected many of its teachings and traditions. In their writings, the two men debated many topics, including what free will was and whether human beings have it. Were people free to choose to be good or not? Other Protestant reformers. Martin Luther set the Reformation in motion. Other religious reformers soon followed. Each reformer had his own ideas and his own vision of reform. Each gained his own set of followers. Disputes, even fighting, arose between some of these groups. One radical sect, labeled Anabaptists by those who viewed them negatively, took control of the city of Munster, Germany in 1534 CE. This sect established an independent community, or commune of believers. They set themselves apart from the world that existed outside the city walls. A Dutch tailor declared himself king of the community. In some ways, they were social rebels, challenging the social order. The Munster Rebellion, as it was later known, didn't last much more than a year. The Anabaptists were either executed or forced out of the city. But it was a sign of how the Reformation was changing not only people's religious beliefs, but their ideas about politics and governments too. One of the most influential religious reformers, in addition to Luther, was a Frenchman named John Calvin. Calvin settled in Switzerland in the city of Geneva. His ideas and teachings attracted many followers, and soon Geneva became the center of the religious reform movement known as Calvinism. Calvin was opposed to many of the traditions and teachings of the Catholic Church. He believed that if the Bible did not specifically tell you to do something in a church service, then you shouldn't do it. He also believed in predestination. This is the belief that some people have already been chosen by God for salvation. Those chosen, said Calvin, would lead a simple, self-disciplined life, devoted to God. Calvinist churches were very plain and bare, with no stained glass windows, no statues of saints, and no paintings. Calvin also stressed social reform. He worked for better hospitals and special care for the poor and needy. He also started a school called the Geneva Academy. Graduates of the academy traveled to many countries, including France, the Netherlands, Scotland, and England, where they spread Calvinist beliefs to new groups. In England, one such group was the Puritans. They brought Calvin's ideas with them when they journeyed to New England in the early 1600s and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony.